it. And I need to make it only that you see one screen.
Now we sync to, I think you can change it from the display settings.
Yeah.
So there's a display setting right at the top.
Display settings, sorry.
Display settings.
The central one.
The central one, the second bit, yeah.
Which one?
No, at the center of it. So
At
next
the
to
center of
that
it,
is
so
the
there-
show taskbar, then you move to the right, the display setting.
Sorry. You mean at the top?
Yeah. Yes, at the top.
Yes.
After show taskbar, where are you?
Then next to it, we have the display settings.
On my end, I see mute. I don't see display setting. Okay, sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now you see it?
Yeah. Yes.
Yep.
Now we can see it.
Now you're good. Now you're good.
Great. All right. Good evening, everyone, once more. It's a pleasure to be here with you. And I'm going to be on my screen now. Just give me a second. Sorry for this. Sorry. All right. Good evening, everyone. It's my pleasure to join you this evening. My apologies. I think we had some technical issues before we started. And as Kelvin has mentioned, I would like to spend some time this evening with you to go through the topic, as Kelvin has mentioned, which I have titled Catalyzing Pharmaceutical Industry in Africa Through Stronger Medicines Regulatory Systems. I did receive the brief from David and the team that you would like to get some insights, especially about what's happening in the continent of Africa, where I do believe most of us are coming from or have an interest in. And I would hopefully by the end of this presentation would leave a flavor. I just would like to warn you that there's quite a lot that's happening. And so what I'm going to present to you here is mostly to provoke your thoughts and your keen interest on the kind of topics that are currently going on. So it will probably not be fully exhaustive, but I am happy to take any questions towards the end of my presentation. So feel free also to take note of your questions. I'll go to the next slide. And the slides don't move now, David. No, it's okay, great. David, confirm you can still hear me?
Loud and clear.
Excellent. So in terms of my agenda, I'm going to speak about, I learned that not everyone in the room may be fully aware or conversant with regulation of medical products in Africa. So I'm going to make an introduction into that. Then I'll spend some time to paint a picture of what's happening in Africa by showing you the situation we have. Then, as per the topic of the day, we will go through some concepts of what regulatory system strengthening in Africa is currently entailing, and I will finish with some of the trends that we can expect to happen, already happening now, but will get into better shape in the future. So starting with some of the facts that we have concerning the continent is, and as well as regulation of medicines, is that, as you probably would know in this meeting, that medicines and other health technologies, as we call them, are highly regulated. And this happens across the world, not just here in Africa. So, and it's important also to note that regulation is important. And I do know sometimes it can come in as a red tape, but it is so important because it is what assures safety, quality, and efficacy of the medicines that we give to our patients. I do believe most of the people here would be healthcare professionals, mostly pharmacists. So it is very important that the medication that we hand over to the patients, regardless of where we practice, are safe and of good quality and efficacious. And I did also want to mention that this regulation, as we speak about it, it actually spans the entire product life cycle, from when there is drug discovery to clinical trials to marketing authorization. And I do know that today we'll speak a little bit more into the marketing authorization and post-marketing activities, but also it includes when the product comes to the end of its life in terms of the withdrawal. So there is a lot of, policies and procedures and regulations that govern all this life cycle of pharmaceutical products and other medical products. The task of regulating products is undertaken usually by drug regulatory authorities. It could be national, but also we are seeing regional and continental bodies, as you'll see in my presentation on the coming slides. For those in the call who may not also be very familiar with this, is that the drug discovery process, or how drugs are developed, it starts actually by focusing on a disease. I think most of the time we think about, the molecule or the agent that we are regulating, but the beginning is, of course, focusing on the disease, getting the target identified, searching for the lead compounds. All this happens at the very early stages, and this whole process until when we get regulatory approval can take years, and it can take time before we get there. And the most important thing to note here is that during all this time, regulation, as we know it, comes in handy, as you will see down the road. So focusing a little bit more on the registration part, clinical trials have been done, initial evidence is available that can avail enough information to allow for a drug to be registered. If you're lucky enough, then as an applicant, you get registration. But even at the point of registration and subsequently when the products are coming to the market, they are still bound by regulations such as, import testing, for instance, what we call here lab testing and quality control. In the entire span of the product being marketed, of course, we have to continue with marketing surveillance, lot release, especially for vaccines. And then we get into the procurement stage before the products get into the distribution, be it in the public or the private. Then we also have regulation, including at the prescribing stage and the dispensing stage. And finally, when it is being used at the patients, and how do we close this is also by introducing vigilance. I am sure most of you here would be familiar with pharmacovigilance requirements, and it's a whole new area which has developed over the last many years, which basically takes care of drug safety and the instance of devices as well as cosmetics and other products, the vigilance when the patients and the consumers have used the products. I would like to paint a picture, especially of what has happened in the continent of Africa, and allow me to share with you some study and some work done almost a decade ago now, because it is important for us to appreciate where we are coming from before we see where we are going. So if you look at this, you see a picture, like I said, when one of the things that we measure when we look at regulation of medicines is one of the metrics is about the time it takes to register the drug, because as you saw, it takes a lot of time to develop one. It also takes considerable amount of time for the regulators to look at the facts that you presented in front of them for them to finally give you approval. And guess what? In Africa, at the moment, we are not developing a lot of these drugs. So we have to really still rely on the West most of the time. And of course, most of the drugs which are being developed mostly are not coming from the African continent. What that means is by the time patients in Africa receive these drugs, especially the newer ones, they have most of the time been developed elsewhere, tested, taken through the registration process. And this normally happens mostly in series rather than in parallel. But from this slide, you see something very interesting. One, it's about the spread in the submissions in the African continent. This is the time it takes between when a product gets submitted in one country and when it gets submitted in probably another group of countries. So it means that being a patient in certain part of Africa, you could actually be missing to access a certain drug or a certain therapy simply because it hasn't been introduced in your country. And that is certainly not a good thing. If you see, for instance, for the newer products, the spread If you look at, it could be as long as, at least during that period of the study, as 52 weeks. At least for the generics, the spread is a little bit less. When you look at the vaccines, it even was longer, which if you think about the COVID situation that everyone went through, this actually could be disastrous, as you'll see a few slides down the road. Another thing was about the time it takes to get approval. You see some good timelines, sometimes of 11 months, sometimes of 18 months, especially for generics, mostly because one of the reasons could also be there could also be some queries and some back and forth that can take a bit of time, as well as the many generics applications that come through. But very interesting is also to see this picture here, which again talks about approvals in what we call the stringent regulatory authorities, taking a period of around 1 year or 12 months. But when you look at the other countries, which are not in the SRA or what we call stringent regulatory authority regions, you see from this study that there was quite a spread between all these NRAs. If you look at NRA 1, it took about from year 1 to year 3, and NRA B, it actually went all the way to year 6, meaning that it took about 4.9 years to get a product registered. Remember, there was already a spread in between. And if you imagine probably that this country was one that had waited for another 50 months before, it means that a patient in this country could actually have waited for that drug for a period of somewhere between 5 years and even 10 years, which is not a good situation. There is even a country here which took more than 5 years to register a drug. Then if you think about this as a continent, because this is picked from mostly African countries, it also tells you that it becomes very difficult to introduce especially new therapies, because it probably may not even make economic sense initially, because the registrations are way too few when, let's say, you look at year 1 or even year 2. So you really have to wait for many more countries to come on board. And with that, then, of course, the patients are not getting the drugs that they deserve to get. Up to now, I've used one metrics, which is about the timelines it takes to register, because I think it's a one good measure that we normally use to show whether a system is effective or not. Of course, there could be other measures. And I want to introduce you to a concept, because the reason why you would have this kind of spread sometimes is because there could be inherent issues in the system that is causing this kind of imbalance. And if you're sitting in there as a regulator, you often find yourself in a dilemma. For instance, do you allow everything that comes through the door to come into your country and into your market, and everyone, in a sense, have access? And in access here, I say in quotes, because proper definition of access is not just that products and solutions are available, but they are available in the right form and format, the right quality, the right safety standards, and so on and so forth. On the other hand, as you see in this case, if you exert too much control, like we saw in the previous slide where I showed you the spread, you tend to potentially cripple access, because you limit or you increase the amount of time it takes for the drug to be approved. So this calls for a very delicate balance. And the fact that a health authority takes very little time to get approval, or takes very long periods to get approval, is not necessarily a measure that it's strong or weak. It is perhaps you need to dig deeper where the challenge is coming from. And you see some of the tools that have been used up to now to try and remedy this, to arrive at a better situation where the spread, as I'm calling it, gets reduced, and you're able to then get the drugs and the health products to the patients who need them, especially in our setups here, as soon as possible. So, as I said, there's a challenge here of balancing the oversight that we still need to have, and also making sure that the products are available. Initially, when we have limited capacity, we tend to allow a lot of things to come into the countries, and that could be dangerous, because you probably are missing on having enough oversight for the products that are coming to the markets. But also, as capacity increases, as we see sometimes, This may introduce other bureaucracies in the process and may actually risk timely access for products. So the picture we have seen in 2012, a decade ago, was mostly because we had limited capacity. As we have increased capacity, we would expect that we are reducing the spread, but at the same time, we are not increasing the times that we need to have for the products to get into the market. Now, if I look at that situation and I look at it now mostly from an industry perspective, I'm an industry practitioner. What do we face on a day-to-day basis? One of the things we face is sitting in the middle here, we have a lot of things to contend with, regulations and their interpretations. We have to look at how do we manage the life cycle of the products. One country is asking one thing and another one is asking for another one. You still have to manage this with production capacity that is available. You have to deal with the GMP inspections. You still have to balance the timelines for submission and how long it takes for things to be approved. You still have to deal with what you call the dossier content and so on and so forth. But what we have seen as industry, first of all, is that we have seen a decade of progressive growth in the pharma industry and the regulatory environment in Africa. And that is a good thing because you're moving from a market which was not as well regulated as it is today. And with that, it has also attracted a lot more interest and a lot more investment into it. What we've seen is a growth in the requirements, but also with that comes procedural challenges. And sometimes this can hamper timely regulatory approvals, and it can, of course, limit, access to the patients that with these drugs. We will see shortly that countries still, of course, remain in what I would call continuum of maturity level. That we have some which are still at the beginner level, but we have a lot more which have progressed towards being more and more mature. We will talk about that shortly. And that is good for the industry in general, because it introduces several elements that are good, like predictability, transparency, that also there is a good confidence that products which are in the market here are well stewarded simply because we are growing in terms of our maturity as a continent. We observe, especially as industry, that strong regulatory systems would actually be good enablers for patients to access safe and effective and high quality medicines and vaccines. And with this, we actually have a clarion call that we appreciate the need to continue supporting strengthening of regulatory systems in Africa. We have been at it as industry for the last more than 10 years now. And one of the things and an example that I'll share later on is actually about harmonizing the processes and requirements that we take medications through. And we actually call for all the other stakeholders, be they patients, be they regulators who we work closely with, be they students, be they medical practitioners, and all the healthcare professionals to actually be able to understand these processes, but also support them. Now, I spoke about the picture that we have in the continent, and I have some few examples here that we can potentially, and this is my classification, that we can put the countries in the baskets. Some are at the entry level, and they are characterized by heavy administrative processes. It's mostly show me the COA or the certificate of analysis so that the products can be imported, or show me the proof that the product is approved in a neighboring country so that the product can be imported. And here, these countries tend to rely mostly on products which are coming from other regulated markets. There could be challenges because even if a product, let's say, is regulated in another market, let's say in this case, I just used the example of France. France is in what we call different climatic zone than in an African country, meaning it is not high humidity, high temperature kind of market. So getting a product from France may not be necessarily okay because it still needs to be evaluated by the African country to see, can it survive the harsh climatic conditions we have? That's just an example of those countries which are at the entry level. Then we have another group of countries which are, I would call, early stage developing regulatory systems. And here we find that they have basic regulatory systems. They are now able to even file for new drug applications. There's a bit of, alternative registration processes now being introduced, such as WHO, CRP, or what we call collaborative registration procedure. They are now even being more affected by the regional harmonization initiatives. They are mainly, however, driven by CMC dossier evaluation. There is limited, let's say, the clinical assessment for the dossier. And here, the basic dossier structure starts to come in. Then we have those which I would consider they have developed to a great extent, and they even have evolved to have what we call multiple regulatory pathways. That such kind of country actually does not only take the products through the traditional processes we know, but they are now experimenting on expedited pathways. They're experimenting on reliance, and they are actually integrating it into their own procedures. They have also gone ahead. They are now dealing with clinical trials, post-approval changes in a deeper manner, pharmacovigilance. They have harmonized requirements. They have a bit still a mix of administrative and scientific requirements, but they are also introducing clinical data assessment. And I gave a few examples here. What we see is that if we want to accelerate towards better regulatory systems here, we still need to invest a lot more in these conversations like we're having today, so that we can move more and more countries towards what is on my right here on the screen. Having said that, I would also like now to bring to you the need and the case for regulatory systems strengthening. It's super important that we recognize that there is a need for timely access to health products, technologies, and medicines. And in recognition of this, WHO, and I will share in a subsequent slide, actually passed a resolution back in 2014 to support medicines regulatory system strengthening activities. And this recognizes a problem, first of all, of fragmented requirements, as we have probably seen in a slide I showed you about the spread of approval lead times. If you use that as a surrogate to show how well a system is functioning or not. And usually we have lost a lot of times in product regulation, and by extension, patients have missed out on getting timely access to the drugs that have been developed. One solution that I would like to note early on here, which has been offered and has been in development over the last 1 decade, has actually been bringing the countries together, doing what we call regulatory harmonization, and actually investing more in the conversation of, can we converge our thinking? Can we converge our requirements? Can we harmonize them so that we move away from being so fragmented that we start to lose time and efforts in everything we do to being able to speak in the same language? Because remember, a patient in Kenya, where I'm based out of, is not different from a patient in Somalia, a patient in Germany, a patient in the US. A patient is a patient, and they deserve to get the drug that they need or any health-related support that they need. As I mentioned, this is coming also and supported by WHO among other partners now. And the whole idea for this resolution coming from 2014 was to build regulatory capacity in member states, which is consistent with good regulatory practices. I encourage you to go and look out for what good regulatory practices entail. But also the other thing is to promote regulatory cooperation, realizing that no one and no country, including the most developed ones, can be able to deal with the requirements for regulating pharmaceutical products, medical products alone, and encouraging the discussion around cooperation, convergence, like I said, and also as well, transparency that is brought through work sharing, reliance, as well as networking. We will see a little bit more of this as we move along. Having said that, where are we coming from as Africa? A story is told of what we call the PMPA, which is Pharmaceutical Manufacturing Plan for Africa, which is a story that this continent started working on as far back as 2007 or through to 2009. And the idea is in line with what is the Vision 2023 for African Union, to be able to become self-sufficient to a great extent as far as meeting our needs for pharmaceutical products. So this plan was set up and given the blessings by the highest organs in African Union. But immediately, the drafters of this realized there was several issues to contend with. And one of them, which is the subject of our discussion today, is actually the regulatory capacity that is there. And there was a realization that without strong medicines regulatory system, there would be no meaningful development of the pharmaceutical sector in Africa. And I think you can bear witness to that. There was an observation that weak regulatory systems, which are normally characterized by fragmented requirements, I've already spoken about that a bit, inadequate coverage of the entire life cycle of medicinal products. Here, what do we mean? That you have a requirement to deal with, let's say, CMC part of the dossier, but hardly enough capacity to be able to deal with like clinical part of the dossier, hardly enough capacity to deal with market surveillance, hardly enough capacity to deal with variations, and so on and so forth. That these weak regulatory systems were also characterized by having different local standards, different formats, different ways of doing things. And this was particularly difficult to coexist in a globalized industry. Like I said, we in Africa are relying heavily on products developed and imported from elsewhere. So having our own local standards here in the continent had made it very difficult up to now to actually coexist in this globalized industry that we operate in, and heavily administrative in requirements and less scientific. The challenge of being heavily administrative is that the administrative things, you deal with them only locally. And we are again saying we don't even have enough resources then and even now. But when you become more scientific, it means you can rely, for instance, on decisions taken elsewhere, and you're able to implement them for the benefit of your people. But up to that point in time, we were heavily administrative. Obviously, these shortcomings and many others were characterized by long lead times. I have already spoken about the lead times. Another surrogate to check whether a system is working is also the standard of products in the market. And even how we are able to tell whether we have the right standard product in the market or not. And this overall made, and to a certain extent continued to make, the environment here in Africa very unattractive for healthcare development in general. Having said that, that was our story in Africa. Obviously, we are not there today, but we have made several good efforts towards, strengthening and supporting strengthening of medicines regulatory system in the continent. And I can just share a few thoughts about what are some of what I would call the facilitating factors that we will see a bit more in the detail. One of them is about harmonizing the requirements and convergence of regulatory requirements, which by its own nature actually helps us to arrive at a more efficient use of the limited resources that we have spoken about. The other thing is to encourage countries to focus on what is value adding and minimize the administrative burdens. Typically, a country which is a beginner or not very strong in regulation tends to rely to overly focus on administrative requirements because that's the starting point. And when you do that, you even pour even more resources and more of your time into activities which may not necessarily fulfill what you're trying to do. But on the other side of that extreme is that we need to capacity build ourselves towards being able to make more scientific regulatory decisions rather than administrative ones. Then the other thing which could also be a facilitator and it's making good traction in the continent is supporting what we call alternative regulatory pathways, as well as good regulatory practices. Here, examples is work sharing, which we are now consistently seeing in a number of countries in various platforms, and as well as reliance practices, which I'll speak about in shortly. Then another facilitator is actually infrastructure support towards things like information management system. During COVID, we actually realized, and we as industry did some survey to show the level of response between countries which had implemented robust IMS platforms and those which hadn't. And there was a clear difference between the two. So the role that digitization, the role that, getting things done online plays is actually very important as far as strengthening our regulatory systems. And as you probably may have heard, there's also a lot of activities going on towards what we call Africa Medicines Regulatory Harmonization. It was for a long time a project, an initiative, but now it's going to advance towards establishment of African Medicines Agency, which I do believe everyone, if not or majority of us here, would be familiar with. When we do that, what and how do we benefit? And we dare say that actually there are benefits which come through for patients, for regulators, for industry. What is in it for them? One of the things is predictable and faster access to new innovative health technologies and products. And that is very crucial for the patients. You saw what happened during COVID, that in certain instances, some countries and many patients in Africa actually didn't get the therapies that they needed in good time, be it the therapies themselves or even the vaccines. And a little bit of that, and there are many reasons for that, could also have been attributed to regulatory systems. And this means more than ever, we really need to work on this to make it more predictable, and as this would also enhance access to the patients for the therapies. The other thing is to make it more reliable and sustainable as far as supply chain is concerned, handling of what we call post-approval changes. And the other one is also the fact that we can operate from the same standard. Like I said, there is no patient in Kenya and a patient in America. A patient is a patient, and they deserve to be treated to the same standard. Then with this coming together and strengthening our regulatory systems, we are also able to have what we would call supply pooling also by manufacturers, because we are also able to predict how long does it take to get approvals in a group of countries and pool them together so that we are also economically able to make the products. And very importantly, as we advance therapies, and especially the new ones coming into the continent, there is integration of the scientific know-how among the healthcare professionals, and this reflects also at the clinic when our patients go to receive treatment. And of course, assurance of high quality and safe medicines for all. Having said that, of course, we are able to integrate our market control and reduce substandard products across the country borders. And we can also attract local and regional manufacture of products with assured quality and safety standards. I would like now to dig deeper into what I would call the 5 drivers of regulatory system strengthening in Africa. And in no order of priority, one of them, and you have already seen that I have articulated it to a certain extent, is about harmonization and convergence. I will also speak about reliance practices, then talk about the need to strengthen the capacity we have at the health authorities. Investment in pharmaceutical industry, in whatever form, is also one way to strengthen regulatory systems in Africa. And I know it's a question of what comes before the other. And then, more importantly, to have legal and regulatory reforms. If I start by health authorities' capacity strengthening, one of the tools and one of the discussions that you currently hear a lot is WHO Global Benchmarking Tool. You probably have heard a lot of countries going through what we call maturity level 3 aspiration. And this is a good thing which is currently being led by WHO and supported by many other partners and stakeholders. And as far as this is concerned, there is a note that among the many member states for WHO, majority of the regulatory authorities...
John, we're losing you a little bit.
Is it better now?
Yes.
Majority of the health authorities actually do not have stable and well-functioning regulatory systems, which correspond to maturity level 3 onwards. And here WHO is committed to health system strengthening and having effective regulatory systems as an essential component to drive that. Meaning that robust and strong regulatory systems are needed to promote equitable access and availability of products and quality assured ones to the populations and in countries around the world, including Africa. So to do this, WHO is actually using what they call GBT indicators, and this topic is quite extensive, and I encourage us to go in the detail and look at some of the documents I'm sharing here on this slide. But to just summarize to you is that the indicators that WHO is using to classify countries in this maturity level is about, one, the national regulatory systems that they have in place, how the countries themselves do what we call registration and marketing authorization, how the countries are doing vigilance, be it pharmacovigilance, device vigilance, and so on and so forth, market surveillance and control, licensing establishments, regulatory inspection, lab testing, clinical trial oversight, and what we call the lot release. And within this, once the countries are assessed, and there's a whole program about that, including what they call IDPs, institutional development plans, to make countries after assessment to migrate up the ladder, if I may use those words, to make them stronger as far as these indicators are concerned. So what is the likely effect of this? So we are seeing countries which are moving from, let's say, level 2 towards level 3, and level 3 is a good and a healthy place to be. Currently in Africa, we have quite a number of countries which have reached there. Close to us here is Tanzania. And I just like to single out that there's a lot of good things happening in Tanzania in terms of improved efficiency, oversight on what happens in the market. And this is highly appreciated, not only by the industry itself, but also by the patients, because it's now possible to get approvals much faster. The quality of approvals is also quite high. So what we have in the market is much more assured. So if you imagine the entire continent, or at least the majority of the countries in the continent going through this assessment, it's actually a good thing, because overall, it doesn't just tell the countries where they stand. It also supports the countries by some of the things I've mentioned, like the IDPs, to get closer to maturity level 3, and potentially in future, we might even see other countries getting to maturity level 4. And with this also, the countries which are ahead of others are actually coming back and supporting the ones which are still in the journey. And this is a good thing, because as countries start to work together, they also, build on trust levels, they build on understanding of what is required between themselves. And this is a good thing. And hopefully, at the end of this all, we will see a system which is stronger, not only in a few countries, but to spread through many countries in the continent, so that the picture I showed you earlier would actually change as we migrate countries from what now here is depicted officially as no formal approach and having limited level of regulation towards level 3 and level 4, which is actually characterized by very stable and formal system in place, to also having one which is in continuous improvement. That is one pillar, and it's about creating the capacity of the health authority. The next one is about convergence and harmonization. And the idea here is to move to one continent which is governed by one global standard. Like I said, and I like to repeat, the patient in Kenya or the patient in Tanzania is not different from the patient in Rwanda, in Nigeria, in America, or any other country. So towards this, there have been, of course, a lot of concerted efforts to get there. And here we have to look at not only the procedures that are in place, but also the requirements. There has been a lot going on, and I think it has contributed greatly to getting us to where we are today. One of this is harmonizing the dossier requirements. Now we can talk about almost all the countries in the continent talking about CTD format, which was not a reality 10, 15 years ago. What that means is we are using the same language. When you say module 3, everyone understands what you're speaking about and what you would expect to find in there. Then the relevant dossier content, what an application should ideally have. Then the issue for regulatory samples, of course, this still remains a challenge in some of the countries, but it's getting better that some countries are eliminating or getting better use of, handling regulatory samples. The whole topic for GMP and site registrations, seeing mutual recognition initiatives, especially with among the PICS or PICS scheme, for instance. In terms of the procedures, defining the review processes and timelines. We are also seeing agency pre-submission advice and discussion, and especially through the regional systems that we have in the countries. Then implementation of variation guidelines. A decade ago, we hardly had many countries, especially in Africa, having variation guidelines. So you worked hard to register a drug, but how it was remaining in the market, it was very different from one country to another, from one, applicant to another, and so on and so forth. Moving on to why do we need regulatory collaboration in convergence? This, we see that it will be actually an enabler of innovation, because advances, as we make advances as humanity in science, we'll be able to meet unmet medical needs, because we are also able to introduce products much faster, because we have a harmonized way of dealing with it into the countries. Another driver for this collaboration actually is about the need for improved access to life-saving treatments. And we also need to keep pace and being ahead of evolving regulatory environment. As I said, no single country in the world can completely regulate on its own. And because of this, the need for collaboration and speaking the same language and having convergence of mind is very important. We cannot overemphasize the need to have better pandemic preparedness, as well as, like I said, to also build trust. So I want to share a few examples here, and Africa is not left behind, of some of the initiatives which talk about collaboration as well as harmonization. Africa Medicines Regulatory Harmonization Program, which I had highlighted earlier, is a good example. You see many, many others here, which in one way or another are practicing collaboration and to a great extent convergence of mind. I can also zero in on what WHO supports such activities as alternative regulatory pathways, which help also countries to come together and harmonize their requirements and so on and so forth. Some of the drivers for this and some of the ingredients for this, of course, is about information sharing and work sharing, as well as joint reviews, as I will shortly show you. So let's talk a bit more into the terms of harmonization, because often you hear harmonization, you hear convergence, you hear work sharing, reliance, and recognition. When you think about harmonizing, is mostly from the technical side of things. Are we talking about the same document? Are we talking about the same format? Then when you speak about convergence, is about the mindset. Yeah, are we able to speak the same language? Are we able to see things from the same point of view? And these go hand in hand. One of the things that you normally would use to actually realize that also is to work in a work sharing modality. We have seen several regional economic communities, for instance, coming together and sharing work between themselves. And in this way, they start to do what we call joint assessments for marketing authorization, for clinical trials, and so on. Then reliance, a topic I'm going to speak about shortly, as well as recognition. So if we do this, what does this mean? And like I said, it's a win for everyone, from the patient to regulators, as well as to the industry. To the industry, for instance, we end up with streamlined management of our regulatory submissions. We have an efficient and faster rollout of submissions, for instance, using the same formats. For the patients, like I said, we have assured safety and efficacy of the drug products, and they actually are able to get that in a timely manner. a lot of benefits also to the regulators because they are able to, address in a faster way approvals for market authorization for drugs. They avoid a lot of duplication of work, and this has a way to reduce the regulatory burden that they have to face. And of course, it is very good for efficient utilization of the resources they have, and also they are able to reduce the backlogs that they often face. This shows that this is not only a topic for Africa. And I dare say that, and here I'm only showing, for instance, in Africa, we have Africa Medicines Agency establishment. Is a lot going on, as I'll show you shortly. But also it is important to see, like I said, this is not something that is only done, to be done only for Africa or low and middle income countries. It's actually something happening globally, that countries are coming together. And there's a lot of trends going on, right from Latin America, countries like Mexico becoming members of ICH. We have also quite a number of African countries now becoming observers in the ICH platform. Yeah. China, for instance, synchronizing the global drug approvals by 2025 so that they are more into the global way of doing things rather than just, their own local way, and so on and so forth. So we in Africa then seemingly are in the right direction. And I think we can be proud of all the efforts that we have put in place and all the initiatives that are going on. And I would shortly just share with you an example from ICH, because it's one good place to look at when we're talking about convergence and harmonization, because ICH by definition actually supports a lot of the harmonization work by providing harmonized regulations and standards and documents. And here, as you can see, for instance, we even have tracking of implementation of the guidelines that come out of ICH by the member states. And you can see gradually there has been an increase in implementation and adherence to the documents and the standards that come out of ICH. And no wonder then we are seeing overall reducing timelines as far as, for instance, approvals are concerned globally. And of course, there are disparities between regions and others. But the overall picture that we see here is that we are seeing more and more implementation of harmonized guidelines. And it's a good thing because with time, then we start to see, especially now in Africa, that once we speak the same language and we work towards the same standard, it makes things easier for us. I'd like to highlight and show you this picture here. And this is one example of median submission lag from the first world submission to submissions in the other countries, especially when you cluster the countries between the founding members of ICH and the newer entrants. And you can see a trend that the timelines have been shorter in the founding members of ICH. And obviously, as countries continue getting into the bandwagon, so to say, or speaking the same language, we can expect one of these things, which is a timeline for approvals, also to reduce. Let me speak about our beloved continent, Africa, because it is important not only to speak about what's happening globally, but also to show where we have been. It is easy for us to sit and imagine that there's a lot of things which haven't happened right in Africa, but there's one thing which is happening well here in the continent. If you see at the bottom there, in 2009 or thereabout, the whole idea for AMRH program, remember about the whole topic for PMPA, in the beginning where there was a realization that we needed to strengthen our regulatory systems, only to realize that each one in the continent of 54 countries, and it was 54 then, and now 55, was speaking different language. You can imagine trying to strengthen these or to make them speak the same language. And the wisdom in the room was, why don't we let these countries actually, start to come together from where they already work together. And this whole idea for what we call the regional economic communities came up. That if you go to East Africa, these countries have been together, trading together, they have an economic bloc. If you go to the Horn of Africa, again, driven by past famine and also conflict in the region, the establishment of IGAD, meaning those countries have a way of working together. Of course, there's an overlap between countries. Then you go to the Southern Africa and you find that there's SADC and so on and so forth. Looking at that, it was, David, is there someone speaking? Can you hear me?
No, it's okay. You can continue.
Okay, great. Looking at that, then there was a realization that it is important to walk towards one continent, but wisdom dictated that it is easier for countries which are already working together to use that platform to start also integrating regulation of medicines. And that's how we ended up with what we call the regional economic community, starting with the EAC and so on and so forth. But the whole idea was actually to walk towards one continent. And we are happy as we speak today, we are almost at the tail end of realizing Africa Medicines Agency, which is, I think, something worth celebrating for us because it has happened in our lifetime, that within this short period from 2009, we are actually seeing the continent coming together. I need to caution us though, we are not there yet. We still have a lot of things that we still need to work on, but we are certainly not where we were in 2009. So we still need to focus a lot more on reducing the disparities that we still have now, especially between the regions, to make the regions work together. It's very good to hear, especially when IGAD and EAC starts to exchange notes, and you start to see that maybe in future, the blue and the orange on my map here gets, more blood, and we get closer to having one continent. And finally, as we get towards one continent, it would mean that we are following one standard for every patient in the continent of Africa. Like I said, some practical examples is the regions working together, realizing that you cannot come from 54 and go to one, but through, for instance, what we call the joint assessment procedures. And there's a lot written about this, a lot of experience now accumulated by the regulators, by the industry and other stakeholders. Then I encourage us to really look into that one of the ingredients that is making us get closer to one Africa is actually joint assessment procedures. The other one, of course, like I said, is working towards having one continent called Africa Medicines Agency. And also it is important for us to look beyond Africa and see, for instance, WHO collaborative procedures using what we call, for instance, either the pre-qualified route or the SRA approved products and many other. And with all this, we can see that we are moving from the traditional, each country doing its own thing, to actually doing two things: bringing the continent together, but also giving alternatives. That today, when you want to have a drug registered in Nigeria, you have a choice. You can either go through the WHO collaborative registration procedure if that particular drug is applicable. For instance, it is approved in an SRA country, and there is an alignment with the SRA as well as WHO. You can also choose to go through the WAHO route. You can also choose to go through the national route. And hopefully in future, you can also go through the continental route and get your product and drug approved for Nigeria. Example for East Africa, for instance, we're moving and we have obviously worked on the national procedures. Each country now has its own procedures for registering drugs. We now have joint assessment procedures, almost getting to the centralized. We are not there yet for mutual recognition, and would hope that one day we'd also get to mutual recognition when countries have reached the same level of maturity, certain level of trust between each other, that it becomes that a drug registered in one country can be recognized in another one. So far, I have shown you two pillars. One is how to strengthen the health authorities, and one tool which we are deploying is the WHO GPT assessment and the maturity level assessment. The second one, which I have explained to you, is about harmonization and convergence. And the third one, which I want to spend some time on, is actually on regulatory reliance. What do we want to achieve with this? Is to achieve more efficient use of resources that we have. Let me repeat that. As the health authorities and of course the industry develop, pressure for time, pressure for resources increases because we are developing more complex therapies. We are developing more products. The pressure to have more alternatives for the patient means the applications are increasing. The complexity is increasing, and so on and so forth. Meaning, a typical regulator, a typical industry applicant is every day faced with the reality that they will never have enough resources to be able to do the job that needs to be done. One powerful tool to overcome that is actually reliance. But before I go on, it's important to define what reliance means. That, and this has now also been defined also by WHO, that here, the regulatory authority, perhaps in one jurisdiction, would take into account and would actually give significant weight. So it's not just for the sake of it, and may end up relying, it is mostly totally, but it could also be partial, on an evaluation performed by another regulatory authority or agency, of course, in an environment of a lot of trust, and they use that to arrive at their own decision. It is important to say to arrive at their own decision, because the relying authority still keeps the responsibility and accountability for the decisions that they take. But what that does is you can look at a scientific decision made. Remember my word about scientific versus being heavy administrative. You can actually rely then on a scientific assessment done in another jurisdiction to arrive at your own jurisdiction in your own country. Remember, you maintain the responsibility and accountability as a country on the decisions you take. That's the whole idea for reliance as we speak about it. And as you see, it is not only on new drug application, but actually on the entire life cycle of a product. And there are some good examples I like to share, especially for EAC joint assessments, because once, for instance, an assessment has been done jointly, then the other countries actually just need to rely on that assessment and take a regulatory decision. And we have seen, for instance, as one measure, drastic reduction in the approval timelines. Perhaps not in all the countries, because the adoption of reliance practices is different between countries, but systematically we are seeing improvement on timelines as well as the quality of the decisions coming from the health authorities. One other example, of course, is, and this is far away from us here in Africa, is also the process that we described for post-approval changes in countries like Singapore and so on and so forth. In between EU and USA, and these are very strong countries actually, they also have some understanding or mutual recognition agreement when it comes to GMP inspections. What does this tell you? That reliance is not a tool that you use because you are not strong, but it's actually an exemplar of a system which is strong, because when a country or a region is strong as far as regulatory system is concerned, then they are also able to make informed decision using a report or using an assessment from another country or another jurisdiction. Reliance is a big topic, and it is very important to look at it from the wider health system perspective. If you think about the world we are in today, we are more and more getting into the aging population. Of course, we have infectious diseases which are emerging and so on and so forth. There is a rising burden of non-communicable diseases against, increasing costs for bringing new innovations to the market, and, lack of enough and adequate incentives, of course, for innovation. If you look at it also, the challenge that we face today is also linked to the SDGs. For instance, SDG number 3 on good health and well-being, and also reducing inequalities. Remember, we say the patient in Kenya is not different from a patient in Rwanda and Burundi and Tanzania. So in this context, if we follow what I have indicated about regulatory reliance, we are likely to see, for instance, increases in efficient use of resources, that are available. And like I said, these resources are not enough, not for regulator, not for industry. And I dare say also, it's not right that the patients keep waiting because we have to duplicate, the efforts that are done by different countries. And of course, if we follow this, then we have a chance to accelerate access to safe and high quality healthcare technology and products. And we have a chance to reduce inequalities across countries and promote implementation of standard of care of treatment. Here in Kenya, we say from our constitution that the constitution guarantees highest standard of care for every Kenyan. And I do believe that this is a universal thing rather than just, for one country. And reliance is one tool, which we do believe, mostly from the industry, from the regulators, and all other stakeholders can help us bridge this gap. Like I said, reliance is not only on marketing authorization, it actually goes through the entire life cycle of products, from clinical trials oversight, registration, or what we call marketing authorization, then post-approval changes, lab testing, vigilance, market surveillance and control, and so on and so forth. But I would like to caution here, for instance, that different countries, different regions are at different levels of adoption. From my experience, the starting point is mostly, at least in African continent, at the point of marketing authorization, which is a good thing. Where we now need to take it to is on the post-approval changes, or what we call the variations, because it is of no use to accelerate introducing the drug to the market, but when it is in the market, then you're not able to maintain it efficiently because you still have to go back to individual country way of working. What are some of the practical considerations as far as reliance is concerned? Obviously, the starting point is guidelines on what documents are needed. How will these documents be used, for instance? Do you need, for instance, to provide what we call unredacted reports? If that is the case, how will the confidentiality be guaranteed? Because one report from one agency has to go to another, and there's an applicant in between there. There should be, of course, good procedures in place and which are predictable, such that, and they are also mainstreamed into the national procedures and the regional procedures, that you can actually follow a reliance pathway. And with that, we would hope that it can reduce the regulatory burden and offer faster approvals and increase access to the patients and for the benefit of everyone, including health authorities and industry. I would like to demonstrate to you also, now that we speak about reliance, where this really falls in. If you think about two extremes, and I mentioned earlier on about recognition, because at the recognition level is where a country and another one, the level of trust, the level of sameness, the level of speaking the same language, the level of convergence of mind, the level of harmonizing requirements, it is at such a high level that one country decision gets recognized by another. But the starting point is where we are all coming from, the standard processes. You are hardly using any level of reliance when you're at this stage. You are doing all the work by yourself as a country. And I don't need to explain to you that this will obviously drain your resources. You will take a lot of time to do your work as a country. The patients in that country will experience shortages of drugs or delayed introduction of newer therapies into the market, and including maintaining the current one in the market. But as countries mature, they start to get into what I would call the reliance ladder. And you start to see that they start to share work, like what we have seen in Zazibona region, for instance. They start to do abridged pathways, meaning I don't take everything, but I partially at least start to look at the reports which are available. Then countries start to work together in what we call, regional reliance. Yeah. And at this point in time, like I explained for East Africa community and for West Africa and so on and so forth, then you start to see that the regional report, the jointly assessed report, is getting wider acceptance between countries. Then you start to have countries one by one getting into what we would call unilateral recognition, between two countries and so on and so forth. Then you reach a place where the two countries actually can mutually recognize each other. And this is a show of maturity as you move from just doing the standard procedures to getting to mutual recognition. Where are we in Africa? You can see that we have migrated from standard procedures. We have gone beyond work sharing in most instances. Now we are even in the regional reliance mechanisms, which is a good thing. We would hope that one day we migrate towards unilateral recognition where feasible, as well as towards mutual recognition. Is there one of these which is right or wrong? Not necessarily. It also depends on the circumstances which are there. But it is important to see the picture that also as you grow in maturity, you probably start also to go together towards recognition, towards higher levels of reliance. That is a third pillar. The fourth pillar is about investment in pharmaceutical industry. And what do we want to achieve here? As we have more and more investment in the pharmaceutical industry, we move from the Me Too kind of products, which are the simple formulations, simple molecules, towards having more complex things such as vaccines and so on and so forth, conducting more trials in the continent. Once you do that, then we start to take the continent into a level where we see more and more drug development and manufacturing happening in the continent. And that has a ripple effect. And there is now a case for pharmaceutical manufacturing plan for Africa. I say that about 2007 to 2009, that was the initiation of the dream. And perhaps the many years gone by, we have not realized that for many reasons. One of them is a subject of what we've been talking about, regulatory environment. You have seen the strides we have made when I explained that we are moving from 555 countries towards getting into one country, and in between there, speaking the same language, using the same standard, increasing the efficiency at which we deliver the drugs to the patients that need them, to a level where now we can talk about having a realistic chance for having proper manufacturing plan for Africa. And this is gaining momentum for several reasons. One of them being the pandemic. I do not need to repeat that patients in Africa really suffered because we were last in the line, to get the vital vaccines as well as some of the crucial therapies that were needed. And that in itself made the continent to wake up and start to think about having Africa-specific solutions. And this is a good thing because it's now making us as a continent to talk more and accept the concept that we need to invest more in manufacturing, pharmaceutical manufacturing in Africa. The next one is, of course, demand is growing. There are more vaccines coming up, malaria and the other diseases. Just, speaking about vaccines, the market is also increasing. This is from a report from African Union. And I dare say, if you go to the medical devices, if you go to the pharmaceutical products themselves, this picture is replicated. And with more demand, it means it's even a bigger market, meaning it's more and more attractive that we can have a viable manufacturing activity in Africa. Then there are newer technologies which are helping us get better at manufacturing economics. That with the technological innovation, it's possible now to have manufacturing processes that can be utilized at low scale, but still be economical. You have seen some news flash in the past about some factories made from abroad and being shipped to African countries in a way like modular units, which are very easy to come and be implemented, and meaning that things like mRNA vaccines can actually be made in Africa in future. Unlike in the past, where we could only think about that as something that can be made outside of Africa. Of course, it's not as easy as I'm explaining, but this is a starting point. Then very importantly is the whole topic for political and regulatory environment. I've spent a lot of time this evening speaking about regulatory environment, and the drive and the desire to reach maturity level 3 is so that we can actually have, for instance, vaccine companies setting foot in Africa because we have the right level of maturity and regulatory systems to be able to steward those vaccines being made in Africa. But importantly, you have seen our presidents, be it Cyril Ramaphosa from South Africa, Kagame from Rwanda, and many others, championing and offering political support. And we really, as an African continent, must take this as an opportunity that would allow us to get to the next level where we can actually have products made in Africa for Africans. I dare say it's not as easy as making products because we need to think about the most viable way to do it. Is it every country for itself? Because that is now an emerging trend. Or can countries come together and have this done in a more economical way? But nevertheless, very important. Finally, the next pillar that I wanted to speak about is about legal and regulatory reforms. And here, the realization many years, a decade ago as well, was as much as you'd like to strengthen the regulatory capacity in the continent, most regulations, of course, have to be anchored in the laws of the countries. There is no one law in Africa. Each country has its own law. And these laws, depending on the legacy issues, like, whether it's Anglophone leaning, Francophone leaning, Lusophone, whatever, they tend to be very different. If you look at the setup for most health authorities in Africa in the past, there were departments in the ministries of health. Then they became standalone units which were partially independent and partially relying on Ministry of Health and so on and so forth. So with that, as much as you would like to take them towards a path of maturity, their hands are tied, so to say. So the realization of this led to establishment of what we call Africa Union Model Law as a starting point, that any country that wishes, in a voluntary way, to make a new law, which is continental in nature, meaning that it is aligned between countries, could use this as a model template to set up itself for success. That you do not have to start from scratch, just like the countries which have taken many years to reach where they are. But we can leapfrog you because we can give you a template to use to start setting up your law for regulation of medicine. And there are various components to it, and you can get the details a bit on African Union website and EPAD. And this law typically will talk about how do you quality control your products, how do you do post-market surveillance, how do you do pharmacovigilance, quality monitoring, recalls and withdrawals, licensing, as you know, control of clinical trials, and many other aspects. This law has now been in existence for quite a number of years, I do believe from 2014, 2015, and currently it's under review to introduce several other elements that will make it even better fit for purpose. There is a good uptake of countries which have either fully adopted or picked elements from it and integrated it into their country laws. One of the other things that this has also triggered is to make some of the health authorities also to be autonomous, that they move away from being a department in Ministry of Health. And by doing that, then they are able also to set up their own path for success. Good. I have spoken about 5 main pillars. Let me repeat them for clarity. One of them is a capacity building, which we can measure using the maturity level activities that are driven by WHO GPT exercise. The next one was about regulatory harmonization, showed you how the continent has moved over the last more than 10 years towards now almost establishing Africa Medicines Agency. The third one about saving our resources and using them for the best activity, following what we call regulatory reliance. Then we also did speak about investing in pharmaceutical industry in the continent, and we showed the example and the necessity for pharmaceutical manufacturing plan for Africa. And finally, about the laws that we have as well as the legal space that we have to operate under. I'm almost coming to an end. But before I do that, I also wanted to share with you some things to think about about some of the trends we are seeing. Some of them have been realized, but some are still out along the way. But it is important for us thinking about the future, the next 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. Where is this conversation that we've been having today? Where will it be? One of them is what we call these products, we call them advanced therapies and medical products, the so-called ATMPs. And this concerns products like cell and gene therapies. Up to now, we speak about small molecules, a bit of therapeutics here and there, but hardly have we even set up any requirements. And it's not only an African issue, it's probably the world over, about the whole topic about how do we regulate these newer therapies, because we need to find a way. The next one is how to use real-world evidence and data. How can we use it to support regulatory decision-making away from the traditional way of supporting regulatory decisions? A big topic for the future, already gained a lot of traction in many countries. We need to think about it in Africa, more so as we grow in our efforts towards also doing more data-driven activities as well as clinical trials. Then artificial intelligence and digital. And sometimes digital can be a buzzword, but it could also mean different things to different people. For us here, it's an entry point, the ECTD, electronic common technical documentation. It's the e-labeling. Do we need to continue having a label inside a pack? Or can we do it differently by doing e-labeling? What do we need to arrive at e-labeling? What do we need for our patients for us to arrive at that level of regulation that still safeguards the interest of the patient, but brings the necessary savings, the necessary efficiencies, and the necessary, especially, to afford to give the patient the latest information about the product without having to go through the bureaucracy of updating and printing leaflets. Very importantly, cloud-based collaboration among regulatory agencies. Today, you file in one country an application, and that country or region has its own mandate, and then we look at the application in their own time. Imagine a future where we use a cloud-based system, and the regulators, and there's no one global regulator, have a way to collaborate in that space and arrive at decisions. Remember the lag we spoke about earlier? It would be possible for the same decision to be taken almost simultaneously between countries because access to this information is almost real-time, same time. Then digital health technologies, especially in clinical development, maybe after COVID time, maybe patients now no longer need to always go to the trial site. There's some probably remote data monitoring. What do they need to have? These technologies, the wearables, when for monitoring clinical trials. How will we regulate that specifically as we grow our capacity in clinical trials in Africa? Then what I'm calling deglobalization. Very important that we have to think about localizing of manufacturing processes for health products in Africa, because with each country is now looking out for itself or each region. The PAVM program, this is Pan-Africa Vaccine Manufacturing Program. Then clinical trials being done in low and middle income countries, more and more. How shall we handle that? Then what we call regulatory agilities. After COVID, countries realized that maybe not everything we have as a requirement is needed. I refer you to a report by EEMEA, which is an international coalition of medicines regulatory authorities, which shows a lot more can be done in terms of dropping the unnecessary requirements and focusing more on what is value add. Importantly, One Africa approach. But before I speak about One Africa approach, I just wanted to go back to that point for cloud-based collaboration among regulatory agencies. Imagine global development. It's a one program, which ends up with one data package. Often it is. But in the end, the difference here is goes to one cloud, which is accessible by all the regulatory agencies in one way or another. And using these activities I shared about reliance, work sharing, and so on and so forth, they arrive at decisions which are leaner, in a shorter time period and in predictable timelines. And it's all for the good of the patient who gets the drug in a timely manner at the end. Back to One Africa, and this is my last slide before then we can go to questions. I don't know how many of us in this room realize that we are in a very, very, very sweet spot at the moment because of the intersection of very important agencies and activities in the continent, starting with Africa CDC. You saw how it came up during COVID period and really advocated and rose to the occasion and supported a lot of African countries to in the efforts towards fighting COVID-19 related issues. And out of there, we had a lot of activities such as what I have talked about, PAVM. There's even what we call AMSP, which is a platform for joint procurement for COVID-related products, and hopefully in future it can be used for others. And I have spoken through this meeting also about Africa Medicines Agency, which we look forward to, and also about Continental Free Trade Area. So imagine when these three are fully well functioning, and you have one drug registered across in the continent, and which, of course, it is responding to the needs for the continent to a great extent, because we are also able to look at our disease surveillance through Africa CDC and all. And that drug being able to move through the continent because there is a free trade area. It is not as easy as I'm saying it here, but it is a dream worth, fantasizing about, but above all, supporting. Because once that happens, a lot of the things that have been an issue up to now will start to fall into place, including localization of manufacturing. Because when a product is made in Nigeria, it can actually end up in Kenya, it can end up in South Africa, and that is a good moment for Africa. So I want to end there and say a big thank you to you, the organizers, and I'm happy to take any questions that may be available.
Thank you. Thank you very much, John. This has been a very elaborate, very informative session. I can tell from the interactions of our attendees in the group as well. Very excited about the topic. Can't wait to also have a review of your presentation once it's shared with them. But once again, we are very excited to have had you speak to us on this very important topic that touches on how we strengthen Africa regulatory affairs. And I like the recap, the pillars, the 5 pillars that you've talked about and how you've broken them down very quite elaborate. I think if in a matter of collaboration, if we continue to look at our continent more in form of we are one block that is joined and we can make access to medicines a possibility, we would be moving in the right direction. The benchmarking that you speak about in learning from countries like Tanzania that are way ahead in terms of achieving WHO maturity levels is quite helpful and insightful. And we have some members from our audience who are joining in actually from Tanzania and from across Africa and beyond. So I want to thank you once again. And at this point, I wanted to very quickly take questions from the group. So I have one question here that asks about what strategies can we employ to establish pharmaceutical R&D center in African countries? I repeat, what strategies can we employ to establish pharmaceutical R&D center in African countries? Here
that's first. That's okay. I can share some.
So that's the first one, and then I can read for you at least 3 more that I have here.
Okay.
Yeah.
Maybe you can read 2 more and then I will respond.
Okay, fantastic. I can do that. So the next question that I have for you here is, how can the various continental bodies, for example, Africa CDC, EEMEA, support the local manufacturing agenda? And still on this particular topic, are there any unknowns that some things that we might not be aware of. So how can various continental bodies, e.g. Africa CDC, AFC, FTA, or EEMEA support the local manufacturing agenda? And with regards to these continental bodies like EEMEA and AFC, FTA, are there some unknowns?
Okay, all right, let me take those two. The first one is on strategies for pharma R&D in Africa. I think there are many things to think about. Certainly, I don't have the magic bullet, so to say, but some thoughts. We have to partner with others. We have to think about and plug into the ecosystem of the rest of the world. I don't think we can afford to do things in isolation just by ourselves. We live in a global environment, and we need to do things in incremental way, starting with the little things, like from our basic research to bringing that to the clinic. I think also looking more at what is needed for Africa. I did say about, for instance, Africa CDC. It would be very interesting to see what kind of disease needs are there in Africa, because maybe we have to develop the next malaria, HIV vaccines out of Africa, because those are diseases which are still affecting a lot of our people, as an example. Having said that, we also need to develop more and more our human resource capacity, but we still need to also fund innovation. And grow from universities through to when we have R&D activities, and we need to incubate more.
Then I think we've lost you.
Okay. We need to incubate more these ideas and find workable partnerships. And there are many opportunities that we currently see in the continent. There are some institutions and some organizations that maybe we can also share afterwards, which are actually looking into that. Another exciting area is also this area for the growing infrastructure for clinical trials in Africa, because for a long time we were out of the picture in the continent. I think as we see more and more of that, it will also trigger more capacity in the continent. Yeah, I hope I have addressed that question. Then the next question was the various continental bodies. Let's see the question. Yeah, so what the various continental bodies can support. One of them, like I said, is the free movement of goods across the continent. A while back, I made a little experiment, and I went to the pharmacy here in Nairobi, and I tried to sample the drugs I find in a typical pharmacy in an urban area. I struggled to find a drug from Nigeria, from Uganda, from Tanzania, but I see a lot from India, from Pakistan, from Bangladesh, from European countries. And I asked myself why. It's many reasons. For instance, maybe it could be a perception issue, but it could also be that today, many of us would struggle to know, how do I ship a drug from Nigeria to Kenya? Yet we know very well, how can I ship a drug from India to Kenya? So with having a free continental trade area, I would hope that we start to break these barriers. When we start to speak the same language, because now Kenya becomes maturity level 3, Nigeria becomes, Tanzania becomes, it means we have the same standard. So there is no issue that I have any doubt that if I find a product from another African country in my country, that I judge it by the same standard. So that, I think, is something very important. And that would mean, hopefully, one dossier for Africa. But there are many things that have to go to that. Then another thing is, very importantly also, is to build what we call continental and regional centers of excellence. I don't think every country in Africa is able to leapfrog itself to a place where they have everything in themselves. We have to agree that we form regional centers of excellence in whatever area. It could be for regulatory science, it could be for vaccines development and assessment, it could be for clinical trials, but we have to accept that. But the journey towards there, as you know, again, we have to be speaking the same language, same standard. So it's all coming back to having these three entities: Africa CDC, Continental Free Trade Area, as well as Africa Medicines Agency. Are there some things we still don't know? By your question, yes, there are some things we don't know. When will AMA really be fully set up? If you ask someone in the room, we probably don't know yet. There are probably a lot of things going on, and we probably have gotten wary of saying, oh, it's still in the process. But we should never give up. Because when you look at European Union, and you look at through their history, they took many, many more years to reach where they are. And they're still not fully, speaking the same language. So we as Africans should be very proud we have reached where we have. But that's not to say that we should now sleep on the job. I think it's a good signal for us to move forward. But yeah, that is one of the unknowns. The other one is, how will the roles be shared? Will my country be swallowed by African Medicines Agency? Will my regional economic community die because there is now Africa? That is important, and those are questions we need to address. How will we transition from national to regional and now to continental? Those are all valid questions that we should answer. Importantly also, who shall work there? Where shall we get the resources, especially human capital? And that is something important for us to start thinking about. I like the session today because hopefully it plants a seed that we start to think about. We need more of us who understands this thing to be able to offer the services to the continent, that we can be the people who work and support the continent to make this dream a reality. And hopefully such sessions that you guys are organizing would lead us there. Any other question from the room?
Thank you. Thank you very much. I have two questions. One that I'll give directly to you. Another one that you'll respond to even as you welcome David, because I think it ties to what he wanted to also speak about very briefly, in the interest of time as well. So as concerns regulatory harmonization, what constraints and challenges remain or have even increased over the last few years? I repeat, as concerns regulatory harmonization, what constraints and challenges remain or have even increased over the last few years? And then related to this, what do we anticipate still being or becoming a challenge for manufacturers, for regulators, and for countries?
Okay. Let me start by answering the first one. Constraints. And like I said, I probably painted a picture that we are getting very good, but we are not there yet. And some of the constraints we see is, of course, not all the countries have fully harmonized their national requirements, and especially the administrative parts, which remains a bit of a headache, and we still need to work on that. Now we speak the same language for module 2, 3, 4, and 5, but we still speak different languages in what we call module 1 in the dossier. Sorry for using the technical language there for anyone who doesn't work in language. Then, the other thing is the regional assessments may not have helped a lot, or to the extent that it would have helped, because there is limited awareness and involvement of all the stakeholders. Hopefully this kind of session can help to build on that. So if today we talk about in Kenya, in Tanzania, in Nigeria, wherever, you have several, maybe 4 or 5 possibilities to take through your drug for registration. But most of us will probably default to the national one that we are aware of. So we need to create more awareness. The next one is about that countries are not equipped to offer their regulatory resources, especially during the joint assessments, because the countries have to make a decision. Do I send my people to the joint assessment, or do I use those limited resources to deal with the national issues which are paid for by the taxpayers in this country, rather than sending them for joint assessments? So we still need to encourage countries to develop more capacity so that they send more people and we see more of uptake of that. Then very importantly is lack of local pathway to implement the joint assessments that have been done. For instance, when we see them in East Africa community. Some countries still have not, nationalized that process. So as much as you have a very nice report coming from the joint assessment for you to use and for your country to rely on it, we are not there yet. So that is still introducing a lot of differential where you have a positive opinion report, for instance, and you still have to wait for a year, 6 to 9 months in place of just 90 days to get approval. Very importantly, we are diverting after we have gotten new registration because a lot of the things we've spoken about, they are not yet capturing variations handling as far as drugs are concerned. So you get into one dossier for 5 countries, but immediately you have a variation, then you start diverging because there's no common or joint assessment for variations. What do we anticipate? The other question was what we anticipate will become a challenge. I think still on that point for lack of harmonized post-approval changes, that remains an issue. We also still need to see more use of reliance on stringent regulatory authority agencies so that we have more faster approval timelines. I think we still need to have clear delineation between national, regional, and continental levels to avoid additional layers of administrative burdens. And we still need to resource our health authorities. You can imagine all these demands that we are having on our health authorities, including telling them to get to maturity level 3. And I dare say we haven't significantly invested in them to move from maturity level 1 to maturity level 3, even in human capacity. So I think as much as we are seeing, let's say, sometimes the road is a bit rough, but we have to remain cognizant that reaching maturity level 3, as an example, also demands resources. And resources not only about money, but also training people so that they are also able to do the things that needs to be done at that level of maturity. Yeah, that helps.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much. And so the last question and a statement as well is, where do we move from here? You've shared a lot of on the pillars and everything, and I want to give to you to comment about it, and then welcome David to also share some insights on what is next. So maybe if I can just read the question out. What are some of the practical ways for us as pharma and regulatory professionals to engage in furthering the progress of the various initiatives growing the pillars you've covered today? In other words, how can we get involved as contributors? And you probably have spoken a little bit about this, but are there any parting shots with regards to this particular question?
I would highlight 2. One of them is awareness. There is a lot going on. Let's create a pathway. I'm very happy for the discussions you're having today because it's one pathway for awareness. Number 2, experiment. If you're a regulatory professional and you need to perform a regulatory task, you don't need to restrict yourself to the old way or the usual way, so to say. Try and figure out, are there alternatives? Those alternatives sometimes come with uncertainty. So you may also have to, think ahead and anticipate that how you deal with those uncertainties, including it's the first time you're doing it. But it is super important. Of course, you have to be strategic depending on what kind of activity you're doing, but plug in and get doing. Then plug in to a lot of the such kind of forums to learn what's happening, to network with other people, to share your thoughts, to share your ideas, to ask the questions. That's what I would say.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And at this point, in the interest of time, I also want to welcome David, who's one of our members from African Pharmaceutical Network, to be able to shed some light on what is it that we can do as professionals in the same industry, looking to further and strengthen regulatory systems in Africa. So David, karibu sana.
Thank you, John, for the wonderful presentation. Actually, I've been just sinking down into the content and trying to distill it all. Thank you for sharing all that. And I think most of us who've been part of the conversation, we've learned, and most important is how are we putting this into practice? And would urge most of us to use this information. And I think something that John has mentioned critically is we need to create awareness. Before you even joined this session, you knew about this session. And if we can disseminate that information for it to get to you, then you can also help us to disseminate the information that you've gathered from this discussion to make it be available to those you are interacting with and working with in all the spaces that you are in. So make the best of the information, and let's see how we can strengthen pharmaceutical systems in Africa. The other bit around this work, and one thing that we actually, from African Pharmaceutical Network, just to give a brief overview of what we do, this is a network that we came up with in 2020. And that was at the backdrop of COVID-19. And one of the key things that we were asking ourselves, yes, there is need for response in the continent, and that response has to be cognizant of the dynamics of the industry, but also the key needs of the continent. And those key needs definitely needs professionals and experts in their different spaces of work. That is where me and you comes in together to saying, how can we use what skill sets we have, and how can we actually build more professionals in the ecosystem to shape that future together with us? That was the basis of African Pharmaceutical Network. So it is a network, and I've shared on the chat as well. Feel free to engage with us, join the network, be a member of the network. Let's drive this conversation together by being part of it and leading the conversation. That is the first bit. But what is the core pillar and the core mission of what we're doing, and how do we execute on that? One, there's the pharmaceutical knowledge workforce development. That is, the knowledge sharing is on pharmaceutical workforce development. At this point, there's an ongoing training that has been happening, regulatory affairs training. This is the second cohort. There will be an intake for the third cohort running from November to December. The course will start officially January 2024. So those who are interested in doing the course with us, feel free to engage. You will get the enrollment form coming, and you also receive it on your registration email as we move along. But beyond knowledge sharing and being competent individual, the question that we are asking and as across the world is, we don't have the opportunity, we don't have the work to do it. How do we get into that space? And that is where we are looking at the possibilities that can we help you get access to platforms where you are networking with people and getting to those opportunities. So that is a key bit, business ecosystem support. There is somebody who is looking at venturing into the local ecosystem who doesn't know where they can get into that, get the professional they need. How can we facilitate that, and what would that look like? So that is some of the key things that we're also looking at. The other bit, and I think that is the last point in presentation that John made, regulatory policies and frameworks. We work in a regulated ecosystem. We work within governments and within nations, wherever we are, with jurisdictions. And therefore, then it means we have to abide and comply with these regulations and requirements. But as we are doing that, we also have the responsibility to shape them. If you're working in an ecosystem and you feel like these policies and these regulations are not enabling and not supporting you to achieve your mission, then you need to ask yourself, how can you make them better? And normally in all our countries, and the best practice across the world is to ensure that stakeholders are shaping these policies and sharing their perspectives. So how are you doing that? Are you getting involved? You can't seed the initial idea, you can review whatever is already there to propose alternative approaches to how that could work. And the last bit and the most critical bit is David alone cannot do this. John alone cannot do it. As African Pharmaceutical Network, we cannot do it on our own. But if we all come together as members of the network and people from the region and actually across the world saying that we have a mission to strengthen pharmaceutical systems, to ensure that we have our people having access to the quality healthcare products that they need, then we can make it happen. And as John mentioned, there's no disease for patient in Uganda, there's no disease for patient in Kenya, which are totally different. We are all patients. And if we are all patients, then we need to have the right quality medicines. When I'm unwell, I don't care who is treating me or who manufactured the medicine, provided it comes from me. How do we make that be the reality of our conversations? So mine is just urge you, join the network, engage with us, let's have the local spaces. Ask yourself, how are you contributing to this movement, and how do we make it stronger for the Africa that we hope for and for the patients that we serve and are committed to making them access the medicines that they need. With that, thank you, and back to you, Dongo.
Thank you very much, David. And I think you've wrapped it up quite well. I believe there are few responses that we will be able to send to you, John, in the interest of time, and you can just be able to respond to them on email, and we'll share with our audience. But very quickly, Thank you, David, as well, for that quick overview of what African Pharmaceutical Network is. Just in keeping or picking it up from where David has left. So we, as he has mentioned, we have an ongoing regulatory affairs training, and the cohort would be wrapping up and passing out in the next couple of weeks. How we do it at African Pharmaceutical Network is also create an avenue where you're able to network with like-minded people. And in this regard, we organized a networking dinner that will happen on the 10th of November, 2023. The venue is at the Royal Tulip here in Kenya, Nairobi, Kenya, Kilimani, and that would start from 6 p.m. So we invite all of you to be able to join us and to be able to come and network and share ideas and share knowledge, all with an effort of strengthening regulatory affairs in Africa. Last but not least, so David spoke about the next cohort of training for regulatory affairs. Once as that link is out, we will be circulating them in our social media. We'll be sending emails to respective members as well. But in the new year, that is in 2024, that is when we'll begin the training. Intake will start from November all the way to December, and we'll start officially to train the next cohort in January. Our regulatory affairs training is supported. We work closely with the Kenya Pharmacy and Poisons Board to be able to deliver this to all members who are interested. The course is also supported by FIP. Last but not least, we are working together with a couple of stakeholders to be able to also deliver a lot more courses in the with the agenda of upskilling and just knowledge sharing. So please plan to join, and as soon as they're ready, we'll be circulating these on our LinkedIn and our other social networks for you to be able to benefit from the same. I want to thank very much so Dr. John Mwangi for giving us time to even be able to listen to you, sharing of your knowledge and your wealth of experience. I think the truths, the knowledge, the wisdom that you've shared with us here is going to be impactful in our various blocks, but also coming together as a region and as a continent. We look forward to putting some of what you've shared with us to use and making sure that we work on the pillars shared with us, some of the practical aspects that we can use to further strengthen the African regulatory affairs system. With that, ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you for being a very active and lively audience. You have been very interactive and made this very easy for us to be able to interact and to also guide you through the presentation. So I want to thank you from wherever you are joining us from. David and I and the rest of the network have this culture where we invite everybody to share their videos towards the very tail end so that we take a group photo. So while we might not be able to convene together in a room based on our various geographical limitations, please, we welcome you to have your video on at this point, and we can just do a very quick group photo. Thank you, Rashid. I see you. Thank you, Dr. Menon. Thank you, Dr. Joyce. I see you. Elijah. Thank you, Juliet. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Wycliffe Dunde. I see you. Kennedy, thank you very much. David, I hope you are taking your pictures. Kennedy, I see you. Thank you very much. And as always, Ijai, one of our students who's doing the regulatory affairs training for this particular cohort. I see you, Jai. Thank you for the moral support with your video always on. I see you, Fanny. Thank you. Suleimani, I see you. Thank you very much. Shaista, thank you for joining us today. Farida, I see you. I hope I'm not missing anybody from the other windows. Okay. Whom have I left out? Wycliffe was trying to, he put Joseph Adongo. Thank you very much. David, I hope you have enough pictures.
Yes.
Fantastic. So with that, I've shared in the chat how you can connect with African Pharmaceutical Network, how we can continue to grow and collaborate together. And as always, Dr. John, thank you for having your video on throughout the presentation. This was very insightful.